If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn it to Luke chapter 5. This is where we will spend our time. One of the features of reading Luke's account that strikes me always is the fact that it's hard to read it and to encounter Jesus in the way that the people who were there encountered him. This was so radical for them. For us, we've heard it before, we've read it before, we're familiar with it. We wouldn't be sitting here if we weren't. And it's hard for us to grasp just how incredible the moments of what Jesus said and did were for the people who saw it. Not for the apostles, but for the common people. They heard Jesus say things that they had never heard anybody say, and in ways they'd never heard anybody say it. And he did things that were unthinkable for a rabbi to do. Unthinkable. And one of the things he came to do was to relieve the burdens of the people. And I think he's still in the same business today. Let's take a look at this text and see what it would teach us about Jesus and who he was. I'll begin reading in verse 12. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came to him who was afflicted with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, the man fell down at Jesus' feet and said, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man and said, "I am willing, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left the man. Jesus ordered the man, "Don't go tell anybody, but go show yourselves to the priests as a testimony to them and offer the sacrifices just as Moses commanded in the temple for your cleansing." Yet the news about this man who'd been healed of leprosy spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear Jesus and to be healed of their sicknesses. But because of the crowds, Jesus would withdraw to a lonely place to pray. Jesus does something here that no rabbi would ever do. Now, you may not be aware of this. I would encourage you, if you're interested in this subject, the subject of leprosy, is to take your Bible and go to Leviticus chapter 13 and 14 and just read the Jewish rules that surrounded this disease. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind, leprosy was a big word to them. When we look at leprosy today, we think of Hansen's disease. It's a disease wherein you become numb and you gain infections and your extremities rot away. That's Hansen's disease. It's a very common disease in some cultures. In Jesus' day, they called anything that had something to do with your skin that was unusual leprosy. I remember a friend of mine who was a missionary to Senegal, North Africa. She's still there. She had poison ivy so severely that it covered her whole body. As a matter of fact, it started where she contacted it, but she was very allergic and it covered her up. And they were very concerned because you can actually get poison ivy pustules in your eyeballs. So you can get in a lot of trouble. She would have been called a leper in Jesus' day. Anything, psoriasis, eczema, poison ivy, anything like that on your skin made you a leper. Well, there were rules. And people thought all kinds of things of you if you had this disease or any of those skin diseases. If you go back, I've done a lot of reading in what's known as Near Eastern history of the region around the Bible times and around the places where the events of the Bible took place. That's called the Near East. There's a huge history there. And so most of the cultures thought that if you had any of these skin diseases, you were a victim of dark magic of some kind. They didn't understand what caused it. They just thought, boy, this is strange. Look at Joe or Hussein or whoever it was. Look at what he's got or she's got. Somebody's put a curse on them. They were very serious. It was a serious thing, and they didn't have any clue how to cure it or what to do about it. There are Assyrian medical texts that we have access to, written on those clay tablets, that explain to us what they thought about these diseases and that they were being cursed in some way. That's what they thought. They seriously thought that. Well, the Jews had a lot of rules about lepers. They had rules for the leper and rules for everybody who encountered the leper, especially a rabbi. First of all, a rabbi could walk no closer than 6 feet from a leper. That was the rule on a calm day. If it was windy, you had to maintain 150 feet upwind from the leper. You could not be any closer than 150 feet to the leper. Nobody ate any food that lepers had touched or had come from their environment. You just didn't do it. It was part of the Jewish rules. The people who lived with these diseases, their life was incredibly grim. Let me just give you an example. I want you all to picture somebody you care about greatly, a child, your spouse, I don't care who it is, somebody you love, and put yourself into this Jewish context of Jesus' world in Palestine, and imagine that your loved one has to go around wearing covering and swinging a bell and screaming unclean everywhere they go. That's what the leper had to do. Think about that, what that meant for that person. Think about your loved one, and that you know your loved one has that disease, and you live in that culture, and they're the one with the bell. It was an incredibly difficult thing. Well, Jesus comes to this leper, or the leper comes to him, and Jesus does what is absolutely unthinkable. First of all, he's well within 6 feet of the leper. That was a no-no right from the beginning. This leper just disobeyed all the rules, and Jesus did too. You know, part of what people thought of Jesus about him being a troublemaker was he didn't obey the rules. You're way closer than 6 feet to this leper. Well, then he did something even crazier. He reached out and touched the man. Now that was just, no rabbi would even, just this guy, well, I don't know what kind of rabbi he is, but he's not the kind of rabbi we're used to. We don't think anything about it. We see all the compassion and the pathos that Jesus contained in his heart for this man's suffering. We don't see it from the context of the Jews who watched this happen on the street that day. They were shocked out of their gourd. They had no idea that this could actually happen. What in the world are we seeing here? Well, Jesus healed the man. And pretty soon Jesus becomes more and more famous now that crowds are starting to follow him around. Well, because of the crowds, you'll notice in Luke, if you keep reading as we go forward, now the Jewish intelligentsia are starting to follow Jesus around. Why? They want to check him out. What's this guy doing? How is it that he disobeys all the rules of the law? Jesus became very famous in Palestine in his day. Now, this may just be a side issue that doesn't mean anything to anybody but me. But one of the things when I'm corresponding with the atheists with whom I correspond, they say to me is, if Jesus is such a great person, how come we don't see him in the other histories? How come the Romans don't record him? How come the Greeks don't record him? How come we don't see anything of him when he was alive doing all these amazing things? That question comes from a complete misunderstanding of ancient history. Every ancient history that's written is written long after the events that transpired. There are no ancient histories where somebody's following somebody around with a notepad and writing things down. They go back sometimes decades. In the case of, say, some of the Roman histories, hundreds of years later, and they research all the data they can find to rewrite that history. Jesus is no exception. There are Roman records of Jesus, lots of them, but they don't appear for about 70 years because that's the way people wrote history at the time. That's the first problem. The second problem is Jesus was famous in Palestine, but you have to look at Palestine from the standpoint of a Roman historian. What's Palestine? It's a little backwater place that nobody cares about. And besides, these Jews are troublesome. We don't like them. We rule them, but we don't like them. And so nobody cared about this new rabbi from the Roman perspective. Who's Jesus? We don't know. 70 years later, they knew who he was, but they didn't know anything about what Jesus was doing while he was doing it because they didn't pay any attention to it. There are reasons why the history is recorded in the way that it is. But he was famous in Palestine, and the intelligentsia, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, and the Herodians started to follow him around. Now, why were they upset? Why were they so interested in Jesus? The last prophet, Malachi, to Jesus is about 400 years. 400 years. Some of your Bibles, if you have study Bibles, it'll say the silent years, 400 years passed. They're not silent. But from the standpoint of the biblical prophecies, they are. Well, in that period of time, a lot happened. The Jews were conquered by Assyria. They deported them. They got through that conquest. 100 and something years later, here come the Babylonians. They conquered them. They deported them. God telling them all along, you've got to straighten up or I'm going to send the Assyrians. The Assyrians come. Then they get a period of fatness and happiness and everything's going good. And then God says, if you don't straighten up, I'm sending the Babylonians. The Babylonians come. They get conquered again and deported. And then the Persians come. Cyrus. You read Isaiah, you'll see him mentioned by name 140 years before he's born. They come and they conquer the Jews and they give them their freedom back. And they say, go rebuild your temple. We'll finance it and protect you while you go. So all of this is happening. From the time of the Persians to the time of Jesus is about 400 years. And boy, did they have troubles after that. They were conquered. The Persians were conquered by the Greeks. The Greeks conquered the Jews. Alexander the Great, 300 BC, conquered the whole region, subjugated the Jews. The Jews then, about 180 years later, get free from the Greeks, only to have the Romans show up and conquer them yet again. And so they've been through this long period of conquest and subjugation. And so when Jesus shows up, and he starts to attract the attention of the Jewish intelligentsia, they're not interested in him because they're looking for a sideshow. They're interested because they're afraid that somebody else is going to come and they're going to be punished again because this guy's doing stuff that our law says he shouldn't do. That's the whole story. You know, we look at the Sadducees, we look at all these guys and we think, these guys are really mean. They're not mean. They really care about their people, but they don't understand what God is doing. They just don't. Well, Jesus comes and touches this guy. He does all this stuff against the Jewish law. When I say that, you'll understand that just a little better in a moment. He's not breaking the law at all. Jesus never broke the law. He fulfilled it completely. What he's breaking is what is known as the oral law. See, you have the Decalogue, 10 Commandments. We know what they are. I'm not going to recite them this morning, but if you would like to, you can stand up and do that. Then you had the 613 precepts of Moses, the civil law, the moral law, the civil law. And then you had the ceremonial law, which is contained within the 613 laws of Moses. Well, there's a problem. How many of you have a copy of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in your possession? It's a tiny thing. The whole thing, it's like a tract. I carry one in a briefcase. It's that big. It's like that thick. It's a tiny little thing. Why? Because it's not completely comprehensive. It provides the skeleton for law. You know how many pages of law we got in Washington now? 20,000 and counting. Why is that? It's the same problem the Jews had. 613 precepts, 10 commandments, not enough. Doesn't tell me everything I need to know. Here's one, keep the Sabbath holy. Well, how do we do that? Moses kind of expanded on that and said, well, you don't work, you don't do this. But the Jews, in that 400-year period, they came to a place when they scratched their heads. They said, what is work? What is work? We don't know what work is. We're not supposed to work, but what's work? Does work, you see it in Orthodox households today. They have a servant in the home that turns the lights on and off so that the Jew can obey the Jewish laws about working. So they said, well, we've got to figure out what work is. We've got to tell everybody what work is, or we won't know what it is we're not supposed to do. So 39 subcategories show up for work. What are they? Well, this is where you see the oral. This is what makes this so hard for the average Jew. Just imagine yourself living in this time as an average farmer or a tanner or a shepherd or whatever you were, a shopkeeper, and there's an oral law that's not written down. And you've got to know it to be a good Jew. How are you going to do it? How are you going to keep it? So they said, okay, what's work? Well, we got to know, if we know what work is, we got to know, well, what's a burden? So they create the subcategories and they say, food weight equal to a dried fig you cannot carry. Can't carry any more food than that. That's a burden beyond that. You can't have any more wine in a glass. You can't carry it any more than would fill a goblet. You can't have paper anymore, use any more paper than that which would contain a small house plan. You can't use any more ink than you could use to write 2 letters. You can't put a bandage, you can put a bandage on a wound, but you can't use any ointment. You can carry just enough water in your hand that if you got something in your eye, you could wash it out. Anything beyond that was work, and there were 39 of those things to describe it. Why did they do that? They wanted to please God. They really did. They wanted to please God. And so they were trying to create laws that everybody could look at and understand the pool rules. You know, you go in a pool and you got all this list of stuff. And if you don't obey them, they kick you out of the pool. As long as you obey these, you can swim. That's what they were looking for, but they wanted them to all be accounted for so that everybody knew what they were supposed to do and not supposed to do. And the law, 613, just wasn't enough. Didn't cover all the territory. The scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians could keep the law. You know why? You know what the word Pharisee means? Separate. They could keep the law because they didn't have to work. They didn't have jobs. They were paid by the temple tax. So, if I sit down to a meal and wash my hands perfectly properly because I got water, because I'm just hanging around my house keeping the law all day, and I don't have anything else to do, I can do all of the things of the law, and I can do them pretty properly. But that person out there who's picking those peppers, they can't keep the law properly. Now, we look back on that, and this is what Jesus was so angry about. You see, the oral law was added. Jesus, remember who he is. This is the lawgiver in the flesh. He knows what the law is, but he also knows that all those 39 subcategories for work are not part of the law. And he also knows that that person out there picking those peppers can't keep it no matter how hard they try. He came to take the burdens off people. He's still doing that today, but here we are today in North American Christianity, we're still placing burdens on people. Why? Please don't mishear me. It's a good turn of heart. It's a good turn of heart that says only certain kind of music is right to have in a church. You've got to have a Sunday night service. Why? Because we've always had one. You've got to wear certain clothing to church. I was in a church, and if you didn't, not only did you have to have a tie, this shirt would have been a no-no because it's got short sleeves. The sleeves won't stick out from under the coat that I would have to wear in order to be part of that church service. As a kid. And you would be called out. Your parents would be called out if your children showed up not dressed properly for that church service. Do you know why we don't have a Sunday night service here? Because we don't want one. Look, when I was in Pennsylvania, I was one of the elders. We had meetings about this. What are we going to do? All these churches around us have Sunday night services. We need to have one. And we said no. The reason is because we've got families that are driving 45 minutes to get here. They get up at 8, leave their house, show up for Sunday school at 9:15, spend their time in Sunday school, spend their time in church, get done with the church, meet and greet, and yuck it up for a few minutes, and by the time they get home, it's 1:30. They go home, they stay home for 3 or 4 hours, and then they pack everybody up and come back for the same thing? No. Let them stay home with their families and have that time before they start the work week to just rest. Right? That's why we don't have one. The same reason. I mean, do you all really want to come back tonight and do this same thing again? I mean, let's be really honest. Don't play church. I don't want to come back and do it again. I mean, I'll just tell you the truth. Jesus was like that. He was so countercultural that nobody could relate to him. These Jewish intellectuals, this is how we've done it for Judaism's 1,500 years old, Jesus. Don't you understand? This is how it's done. Here's the lawgiver saying, you've really fooled around with this a long time now. This is not how it's done. Those people out there picking the peppers can't keep these laws. I love them too. So the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the Herodians, they saw Jesus challenging that which for them was 1,500 years of tradition, and they said, we're going to get rid of you. The best people in the culture were the same people that took Jesus to the cross. The best people in the Jewish culture were the ones that took him to the cross. So we have rules like that, don't we? And they're burdensome. The clothing rules for church, the types of music. I used to travel, those of you know, I traveled for 18 years in 2 different Christian bands. We were scheduled to do a concert in Asbury Park, New Jersey, Ocean Grove, on the boardwalk at the Pavilion. You ever been to the Pavilion? Big building, wooden seats everywhere. It's a beautiful old building. The Methodists own that building. It's a Methodist building. And a bunch of churches had gotten together and they said, we're going to bring this band in and we're going to have a concert here. Well, we got there, we set up, we're doing the sound check. We're playing what we were going to be playing that night. Well, the groundskeeper was there. And I could tell while we were sound checking, the groundskeeper was not happy. He was not happy. And I watched him as we were sound checking, and he grew more unhappy the longer we sound checked until we were done, and I came down off the stage. He walked up to me and he started having a conversation with me to explain to me how this was God's house. And what we were doing in there was not something God likes. And I'm scratching my head thinking, well, it's the church has brought us in. We didn't just show up here to defy your rules. You know, they brought us here. They heard us. They heard the CD. They knew what we sounded like. They knew what we were going to be doing. Well, we got into a back and forth, and he was a huge man. He towered as a mountain. And so finally, the shouting died down this way. He leaned over to me. Of course, I'm not being a large man. He had to lean over. God still speaks in a small voice, doesn't he? Beads of sweat, spittle coming. I mean, he was really upset with me. But you see, he believed that there were certain rules that the church had that we were breaking. That's what the Jews thought of Jesus. The Jewish intelligentsia looked at Jesus and said, 1,500 years, you're not doing it rightly, Jesus. And those rules that we have, that guy that was mad at me that day, it's a good turn of heart. He loves the Lord. He thinks that we're offending the Lord. He's not doing that. What he doesn't realize is what we don't realize many times, is that we substitute our personal taste for what we think God likes. And we assume it. God may not like us being here in this building 8 times a week. God may want some of those people to stay home with their families. But we just assume because this is church, and we say that all the time, don't we? This is God's house. What a lie. It's just a lie. I'm God's house. You're God's house. The Spirit of God lives in you and me, not in this building. What does it produce? The good turn of heart produces these rules, and what do the rules produce? Well, in people, they produce guilt. Guilt. 18 things going on in a really large congregational setting all week long. And not everybody can attend everything, but those who can attend. I've heard this said from a pulpit on a Sunday night to the congregation that was gathered. I heard it. I won't say where. I heard it. You all are the right kind of Christians because you're here on a Sunday night. Those other ones aren't. Can you imagine? That's the kind of rule that Jesus came to set us free from. That same kind of rule. It produces, instead of the conviction of the Holy Spirit, it produces self-hate. I must be the wrong kind of person because I really don't want to go back on Sunday night. Let me show you how God is. Let me give you a picture of who God is, the way God looks at these things. That's what we want, right? How does Jesus really see this stuff? H.G. Wells, you may not know who he is, one of my favorite authors. Read many of his books. I've got a book about this thick at home with about a dozen of H.G. Wells' stories, The Time Machine, War of the Worlds, 10,000 BC, and on and on and on and on. I love those stories. He became famous. And of course, when a person becomes famous in our culture, the trappings of fame become available to them. Money, women, in H.G. Wells' case, wine, all of the things of life that we might think would be attractive to people became available to him because he was wealthy and famous. Well, one of his friends came to him and said, H.G., how do you avoid the temptations of all the things that you can do now that you're famous and you're away from your wife? This is the 19th century. I mean, there's no cell phone, so his wife doesn't know what he's doing when he's traveling for a book tour. She doesn't know what he's engaged in at all. He could do anything. He said this, and this was powerful for me. Listen very carefully. He said, this is how I avoid the temptations. There is someone sleeping in my home who trusts me and who is so pure and so sweet and so clean that it is unthinkable that I should show up in her presence squalid, drunken, or immoral. What is that? That is that he loves her so much that he doesn't want to hurt her. That's the relationship we have with God. God's not a policeman waiting to whip us. If we love God, our desire is to do absolutely nothing in this life that hurts him, because we love him, because he's so pure and so right and so loving and so giving to us that we don't want to hurt him. That's what Jesus was driving at in his ministry with regard to the rules that they had set up. Let me tell you something, and you know this to be true. No rule will ever change a heart. No rule will change a heart. God changes hearts. I don't know where everybody